Everyone, welcome back to another interview with Zaki Property. Today we have our lovely guest Shahed on with us today. Really looking forward to this interview and everything that we're going to be covering in it. The focus of today's interview is investing as a doctor. Shahed has built a massive portfolio in a really short time, just closed on his sixth or fifth or sixth, was it? Fifth property. I'm already getting ahead of myself, crunching the numbers for number six already, and on his way to build a massive portfolio. So today we're going to be discussing how he did it at such a young age, how you as a doctor or healthcare professional can approach property investing, and what can one actually get out of property investing, right? There's obviously just there's these numbers. I own 10 properties, I own 20 properties, whatever it is. But what can an individual tangibly get as a dollar value? But before we jump into all of that, Shahid, tell us a little bit about yourself, the man behind the investments.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Asha. Thanks for the kind intro. We've known each other for a long time since my undergraduate university days at Melbourne University. So it's nice to kind of connect the dots and work on exciting things together like this. Essentially, yeah. So I was originally from Bangladesh, but grew up in Dubai and moved to Australia in 2010, 2011 with a dream to pursue medicine. Initially did an undergraduate at Melbourne Uni and then went on to do medical school at Deakin and have been a doctor now for about 5 years. Yeah, so it's interesting to think back and reflect on what's happened over the years. I remember, as a student, early days when you come as an international student, especially as a 17, 18-year-old, it's pretty scary to dream big. And all I thought is, I'll just become a doctor and then, that'll be the end of it. And then you just become a doctor and you realize, oh, there's so many other things and another mountain to climb. And especially when you think financially, I remember as a student thinking, oh, how much money would you need to feel rich, quote unquote rich? And, we live in a society where often we don't talk a lot about money and we're not transparent. So I actually had no idea. And I remember somehow thinking maybe 50,000, like I'll have $50,000 and I'll be set. Like that'll be so much money and it'll all be perfect. And then you start working and you go into the real world and you realize, there's so much more you need to do. So yeah, long story short, I worked at Geelong after finishing medical school as an intern in the general year, and then currently in Melbourne now. Just finished my physician training and starting gastroenterology training next year. So thankfully, no more exams, but hopefully doing my time of another at least 2 years, and then I'll be a gastroenterology consultant. And then yeah, in the midst of that, obviously there's life things, and one of the things I've tried to focus on is building assets, as they say. I still remember, very tempting once you get your first paycheck and the first few paychecks, to spend it on a nice fancy car. I did go to the Mercedes showroom as well, thinking, oh, maybe I'll get something fancy, but then I tempted and got a second-hand Mazda instead, which I still drive and plan to for a while. And yeah, use all that money and worked harder to put in some appreciating assets such as property.
Beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, look, they say cars are depreciating assets, but a second-hand Mazda, honestly, sometimes those the second-hand market's so powerful they can appreciate themselves. But that's the way to approach it, right? Make your money work for you, especially doing that early on. Again, as an individual, you wanna find that balance of lifestyle and investment. But definitely, especially when it comes to money that you're lending, you never want to put your money that you're lending in an asset that's not going to grow over time. Like I'm a really big believer in that. But yeah, so much that you touched on over there. I think one of the interesting things you mentioned is coming as an international student. And we both came as an international student. Obviously, you were slightly further on in your journey when I came. I was like the baby of the group. And it was tough, right? It's like the stuff that we had to go through early on. And it's like, and then now coming to where we are and where you are, it's very impressive. Congrats on getting the placement for the specialization that you want to get into. And it's just one of those things when as you come, you build that knowledge. And if you have those goals, like you can just achieve whatever you dream of, right? So yeah, good to hear that everything's going really well, and your investment journey is going really well. And hopefully, the people listening at home can take inspiration from your journey, because I think it's a pretty inspiring one. You mentioned coming as an international student, not easy, right? Then like competing in medicine as an international student, and not even as an international student, just as a med student, getting into those specialties, not easy. But then while doing all of that, having the headspace to channel your funds and invest in a really smart way, ticking off the boxes. So yeah, hopefully everyone at home can draw some inspiration from uh today's interview. So let's jump into the meat of it. Let's start off generic and in terms of like more conceptual stuff. And then we'll jump into, and as we talk about that stuff, we'll try to relate it back to your particular story and hear from that, right? So I wanted to start off with a few of the big reasons why investing as a doctor in property specifically is really important, right? So I've got four big ones over here, and I'll quickly touch base on them, but then I'd love to hear from you from your perspective, how you approach this and why you thought about it like that, and why you thought about it the way that you did and how you executed on it, right? So the first big one is doctors, high income earners have a very high amount of borrowing power, right? Compared to your average individual, they're probably like the top 1%, especially because they're high income earners. Plus, banks love doctors, right? Like, all the deals are like even if you go to these, when new med students come on, all the different companies are there giving out the little pens and stuff like that. And there's a reason, right? Doctors have massive borrowing power across their lifetime. And to me, if you're a doctor and you're not buying investment properties, you're pretty much leaving that borrowing power unused, right? It's just like it's almost like you're a business owner, you have an employee, and he's just sitting there doing nothing. And you could be putting him to work to make extra money for yourself, right? So, do you want to tell me a little bit about how you approached borrowing power and some of your thoughts on it are?
Yeah, absolutely. I think just adding to what you were saying before, um, we only can spend time on so many things, and people who study medicine or become doctors spend a huge part of it just studying and learning, and often that means they don't have a chance to either think or reflect or learn a lot about money. And that's definitely been the case for me, that I've had to spend much more time later in my career try to think about money and learn and talk to people like yourselves and other experts to just understand how do you plan, what are you meant to do with your savings once you start making income. And particularly coming to doctors, because oftentimes I feel like because of our profession we're quite conservative, because day to day you deal with people's lives, so you want to play safe bets. Things like debt are pretty scary, being alone and are pretty scary. You want to be safe, you just want to spend what you have, you don't want to have massive debt, use credit card, things like that. So you really have to like unlearn a few of those initial inertia that someone might have to jump into taking risks, which this essentially is. And then you have to do your due diligence on what you can do. In terms of borrowing power, I think, again, there's a couple of ways to think of it. When you start off as an intern, as a resident, your base salary, it's pretty good compared to average, but it's, nothing magnificent. And then you've been broke for majority of your life. So again, your habits are usually that you want to have a nice meal, go out and actually spend some money. So there's often not a lot on cash reserve to just, jump in and buy heaps of properties, which it might seem like. And initially in my first year or two, I used to think, you know what, maybe I'll just wait 10 years. I'll wait 5 years, I'll become a consultant, the income exponentially increases, as most people know, and they will be much easier at that point. And I think obviously there's a few ways to not have to wait. And then if you know anything about property market, 10 year in a market is too late, and there's a new market there. So I think it's important to jump on early. One of the advantages, as you said, in Australia, very lucky to be healthcare professionals, where I didn't even know this before starting, that you could start at a much smaller deposit. Your jobs are relatively safe, so banks are pretty happy to borrow you money, and then I'm sure you can add more. But then there's things like lending, mortgage, insurance, and things which you get waivers for, so you don't actually have to have that much upfront money. So one thing I got really, lucky or unlucky with is after I finished my internship, COVID hit. This was about 2020, and as part of that, I used to do a lot of additional jobs, commonly known as locums, especially around COVID clinics and things like that. And that really helped me build up a deposit. I also met my beautiful wife then. We weren't married, but we were dating, and I also got her into locuming. So we both kind of started saving a decent chunk, and that's essentially how I actually got started. So I'm not sure if I'm directly answering your question, but I'll just say how I got started. But yeah, so then we started saving, just thinking more, we'll buy a house for ourselves. At that point, it was not investment and that kind of thing. And then again, if people remember during COVID, the Melbourne market was absolutely insane. The property prices were just sky high, lots of auctions and things like that. All the money that wasn't spent on travel was spent on property. So then I and my wife, we were looking for a place. We found near to where we work. And essentially, overpaid by almost $100,000 for that property. Looking back, it was a great property. We really enjoyed living there, but not the best financial decision. So just looking at that process and reflecting on it, I realized, you have to make smart decisions about buying properties and things. So then from that point of view, I started looking into how you save. Got in touch with the broker, buyer's agent, chats with you as well, and then from that, I think we started thinking about borrowing power, and I think you can add more, but obviously we've come a fair bit now with our journey, and then there's trusts and other things. But the initial, I think, bump was doing that locum, saving up, making most of those advantages such as LMI waivers, smaller deposits, and that's how we got started in terms of having the borrowing power to buy our own home and then also moving to investment property.
Yeah, beautiful. I think like one of the points that you hit on there, which I really love, is doctors, their day-to-day makes them very low risk, right? It's like, because again, if they take a risk, someone could die, right? It's not like, let's I mean, if you watch House like myself, the guy's taking some crazy risks, and it's like, but in real life, it's very, very low risk, right? And they that's fine, right? Different individuals have different approaches to life based on their personal experience, so on and so forth. But there's this assumption that using borrowing power is a high risk thing, right? It's only high risk if you want it to be, right? You can buy very low risk investment properties that, one, have easy liquidity, two, like natural, definite growth, good yield as well. Maybe it won't be exponential compared to some other areas, but over that 10 years, the price will close to double, right? So you're doubling money that you've leveraged across a 10-year span. You can obviously go super risky if you want to, but this assumption that using all that borrowing power is inherently risky is not true, right? It's as risky as you want it to be. If you go buy land in some super rural area and then you're like, I'm going to subdivide and all this kind of stuff, yeah, you could 5x your money, or you could lose it all, right? Whereas if you buy simple data-driven investments in low-risk locations, I'd say it's one of the lowest risk investments out there, right? As long as you have that buffer cash to hold it. So that's one of the first reasons. And you touched quite a lot on entering the market early as well, which we're going to touch a little bit later on, because I know we're going to have a lot of young listeners, young doctors listening to this who are thinking about entering the market but want to enter in a smart way. But before we come to that, let's talk about another phenomenon that's really important to investing for doctors specifically, right? And this is the tax component, right? So obviously doctors have heaps of tax that they have to pay, right? And that progress, over time, their salary increases, and naturally the amount of tax they increase, their pay increases, right? And property can be a pretty useful vehicle for decreasing tax, right? So I want to get your thoughts on how you thought about this, how much of a factor this was in your mind. Obviously, we're not going to cover all of the tax implications of property investing. That's probably a separate 5-hour video that we get an accountant here for. But if you're interested in that, you can just touch base with us. We'll share those resources. Today, we want to get more of your thoughts, Shahed, on how you were thinking about it as a doctor.
Yeah, I must say it's a steep learning curve to learn about tax. So, it's a learning in progress for me, and I think one of the hardest things that has been for me to learn about the financial side of things, because there's so many small things you can do, you can't do, so many nuances about deductions and things like that. But I think I can like definitely talk more about like the why behind it rather than the what. And as you said, like there's accountants, there's specialists, and different experts who understand a bit more about what to do and how to do it. But definitely the why is like you very quickly get into that bracket where you're paying almost half of your income in tax. And I know there might be this conception that you become a doctor, you make a lot of money, but there's a lot of opportunity cost as well. Like I got really late into working full time compared to my friends who did engineering out of university or things like that. So they already had bought houses at a few $100,000 less in what I would have had to buy. They've already built assets, so there's really some catching up that you have to do. And then you have really busy jobs, you work really hard. So there's often times where you think, oh, I'm working so hard. Where's all this money going? Obviously, tax is important, and there's a need for that in any society and system. But I wouldn't deny, and just being honest, that every now and then there's these moments like, oh my God, where's all the money going? I work so hard, and half of it is gone on tax when you look at your paycheck. And when you do locums and extra shifts and pick up shifts at your hospital, obviously, the more you make, the more tax goes. And just in the end of the year, look at it and like, is this even worth it? I'm working so hard and not actually taking much home. And I think from that point of view, when you think about it, there's not really a lot you can do. Like, there's a tax system, it's pretty rigid. There's obviously the salary packaging side of things, which everyone would do. And that's the 10, 15,000 that there's the limit. And after that, the only realistic way is, looking at properties, obviously deduction. So every year for the number of properties we have, we do a depreciation. I think there's a fancier word for it, but yeah, we send to a accountant and they do these assessments and then they give us a profile and then the accountant just uses it to reduce some tax.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And I think like this, again, you're touching on so many interesting concepts. One of the things that I love there that you said was opportunity cost. I think this is a phrase that like it's constantly in the back of my mind, like one as a like a person working with investors, but even just life, right? Like everything you do, you're doing that instead of something else, right? And like having that opportunity cost framework allows you to understand what's the most useful decision to make, right? I think when it comes to investing, like I tell most people, don't make the primary reason you invest taxation because you make money through capital growth, but the amount of tax deductions you can get, like, is crazy, right? On like yourself, on like a 4 or 5 property portfolio. Again, it'll depend on the age and the cash flow of the property, but you can decrease the amount of tax you're paying by 60, 50, 60, $70,000, right? And all of that money goes to paying off your portfolio and increasing the value of your long-term savings. So there's a lot of money that's going one direction that could be going another direction and working for you personally. So we talked about borrowing power. We talked about uh, tax, right? Again, if you're more interested in the specifics of it, I'd say touch base with us. We have a lot of good resources, but at the end of the day, your major point of contact is having a really good accountant and getting the best taxation advice so that you can save as much, one through property investment, but other directions as well. So the next concept I want to talk about, again, similar to borrowing power, and this is one for your slightly older people, actually, right? And it's this phenomenon of lazy equity, right? And I've actually have like a few clients that fit this brief. They didn't really think about investing. They bought their own home. It's more like our subcontinent ethnic mentality, buy your own home and pay the debt down as fast as possible, right? It's just like every paycheck you're paying, decreasing your debt, and you pay off a 30-year loan in, I don't know, some of them in like 6 years, right? They just go really hard at it, right? But then what happens is they reach their 45, 50, what early 40s, 50, and they have a lot of what we call lazy equity, right? There's $2 million, $3 million worth of equity sitting there that they could use to buy more investment properties, right? But they haven't because of that mindset. So now it's kind of like shifting that mindset towards using that equity to work for you to buy more investment properties. Because once you have equity, you don't need to use that cash upfront to make more purchases, right? So obviously you haven't come to this dilemma where you didn't invest for a really long period, but then and then use the equity, but you rather continuously used your equity to make additional purchases. So do you want to take us through your perspective on why having equity and using equity is important for a doctor?
Yeah, 100%. And I think one of the really important thing is to just time how you use that equity. As you said, there's a lot of people who just, not do anything with it or just not forget about it and then realize what's happening towards the end. So it's important to plan. As you said, like, one of the things you can do is, you buy your first couple and hopefully you get, lucky and make right decisions and the equity, and you can use that extra cash to buy more rather than having, extra income. And the other thing that I only recently realized, which really worked out for us, is obviously there's parts of our training and job where I have more time when I don't have to study for exams compared to others. So what I did is early on when I had that time, I did extra shifts, did more locum shifts, make more income, and got early into the property. And we got really lucky where a couple of our properties just had a good growth in equity, and then we've just recently refinanced, and then using a bit of that to get more properties. But also one thing that really helped me is having some of that extra cash reduced that anxiety I had when I couldn't do the extra shifts. And I recently finished physician's exams earlier this year. And anyone watching who knows anything about it, it's 18 months of your life that's just gone. You work full time, you come home, you study, you go back to work, you come and you work as a medical registrar and usually very busy public hospitals. So there's very little opportunity to do extra shifts. So I got really lucky there with doing that period where I could not pick up extra shifts. I had that equity just as a, I actually didn't end up needing it, but it was just nice to have that if there was any cash flow crunch I had to top up in my negatively geared properties, I could, top up with that. So it's nice to have that buffer. And I think now, having been post exams, not using or needing to use a lot of that equity money, we have the opportunity to now go ahead and build our portfolio further without having to put much out of our pocket, which is a really nice place to be. So I think you can add, more on those details on how that works. But I think it's important, again, when I just reflect on it, that starting this process, I really didn't think that was possible. Like, it might sound silly now when I talk about it, but obviously people explain that concept to me, that you buy a property, it goes, has capital growth, you can take the money out and use it for other things. But it just didn't feel like it could be real till it actually happened for us, where the refinancing happened and the money came back, and then there was this big chunk of money that just came, and it just really made me I don't know the right word, but like, I just did not believe it before it kind of happened. Because I think when I started, I saw some people, who were far ahead in their property journeys. I used to often think, how do you have that much cash? Like, obviously every property you buy needs, 10-15% deposit, there's stamp duties, there's other expense. Like, on average, you would need $100,000 to buy any properties. And I have to think, how do you have that much cash? Like, it takes me ages to save anywhere near that amount, no matter how hard I work. So I think just going through that process now, being able to refinance, use some of the equity from some places, and actually grow has been, quite a surprising but nice experience.
Yeah, and honestly, it is the most powerful tool in investing, right? It's like realistically, you only need cash for your first purchase. And then for the additional ones, you just wait for that equity and you go. And if you follow a data-driven approach like you did for a few of your purchases, you can get in the right area and get the equity to purchase the next one in 12 to 18 months. Sometimes even less, right? Like you get 150K growth in 12 months, boom, get your equity go again, right? And like you mentioned, there's so many benefits of that, right? It's like you have that cash buffer, which it was important to you just to de-stress. I remember when you were going through the exam period, you were even doing like studying holidays where you'd go to Bali just to, or like go overseas just so that you can study in a relaxed space, right? Which is, I know it's like, it's brutal. I haven't been through that process, but I've worked with a lot of doctors and my previous my previous role in this space as well. I've interacted with a lot of doctors, and I know it's a very stressful, hectic time. So going through that process of investing early can give you those buffers to so that makes things easier along the way, right? So yeah, definitely. Again, it's like for those who don't understand the concept, definitely take time to research and understand this idea of using equity to make additional purchases. Because I think once you understand this, investing in property just becomes a no-brainer, right? Because it's like, I just need to buy one. And then even if you prefer stocks or crypto or whatever, if you prefer like any other asset class, right? You can invest in that asset class. Like go ahead, do it. You know what I mean? Maybe you have like a lot of knowledge about stocks and you're really passionate about that. Put or invest all your money there. Good on you, right? But just buy that one, spend that money to buy that one property, get something high cash flow if you want to mitigate your costs, and then just let it grow and buy the next one and then buy the next one. And even if you're extremely conservative as a doctor, by the time you retire, you should have probably five, right? If you go like super, like if you don't do stocks and you put all your time and effort into property investing instead of other investing classes, you can be huge, right? It's like the sky is the limit, right? It just depends on how early you start and how well you execute, right? So equity, super important concept. Good to hear your thoughts as well. Let's talk about the final reason for investing. And I think this is more like the big one, right? It's like the encapsulating one. It's what do people actually want to achieve out of investing, right? Like a lot of you'll hear on the news, oh, this guy has got 50 properties by the age of 50, or I think there was the one guy 30 by 30, or you speak to some uncle, he's got 60 whatever it is, right? But at the end of the day, especially, I think like for older people, that the headspace was just buy properties as many as you can and then die, and then your kids inherit them. Like I think the younger generation, it's no longer that headspace, right? We actually want to see the fruits of our labor, the benefit of our investing. So let's start with you, and then maybe let's talk about like doctors as a whole. What should be that goal, that outcome that they should aim for as investors?
Oof, hardest question you've asked so far. It's a tough question. And as I was saying, like it's something I think a lot about. And as I get older, I get in different phases of my life and career. I change on how I look at money, how I think about money. Um, to be honest, I don't have a very good answer. So I might rant some of my thoughts. So like just ramble a little bit, but I don't have a polished answer that you might or your audience might like, or what is the goal. And I think there's a few reasons, as I said like before, that we usually don't talk a lot about money as culturally in our schooling. Like we don't get taught a lot about like what making money means, what saving means, like even the concept of the fact that if you like initially when I started working, as I said, my target was to make 50,000. So like, I would aggressively work and put that in a savings account and just leave it there. But then, then you start realizing there's inflation, like that 50,000 in 10 years time is not 50,000 anymore. Like you have to do something with that money. That's what, I'm glad you kind of mentioned about stocks and things. Like it's important to do something with it. Obviously, property has lots of benefits with leveraging, like, the risk profile, there's experts and things like that you can have access to compared to stocks where you can play around. And I'm a big advocate of diversifying. I do a little bit of stocks here and there. It's important to diversify and put your money everywhere. So I think, as I said, like with time, my viewpoint on money changes. With every book I read, like recently I read a book called Die with Zero. So it's interesting you were saying about inheritance. Like this book talks about how, essentially what the title says, you die with zero. Like, if you give a few $1,000s to your kid when they're 25 for a trip to Europe, that has much more value for them than if you leave them like $500,000 when they're 65 and they already have their own kind of asset class and they're not going to do that much with that money. So it's it's interesting. So I think a lot about that is like where we want to be in 10 years, in 15 years, 20 years. The other thing that happens is, especially in our career, I think it's a lot of burnout. you have to give big parts of your life to studying, getting the training programs, finishing training. And I'm not sure if it's just me. I'm sure there's people who absolutely love their job and they wake up every day and that's what they want to do till they die. And good for you. And you can continue doing that. But I can see how my perspective toward my career has changed over the years. Like I still remember when I was an intern, the first few months I'd wake up in the morning, put my badge on. I was hella proud to be a doctor. I'd be like, I'm going to go to the hospital, save lives, stay back. I don't need to be paid overtime. Like, this is awesome. I love it. But then you do that for a few years and you're just like, oh, I have to do this other night shift on my seventh night and it's extremely busy. So I think it's important to plan that where you see yourself in the future. And I think where I'm headed, I definitely want to, you know, perhaps slow down in 10, 20 years time. Like I'm 31 now, maybe 20 years of more intense working, and then from 50 just start slowing down would be the plan. Cutting down as much work I do and just relying more on assets and going from there. But I think it's individual preference on how people would see themselves as future. I still think a lot about it. That's why I said, I don't have a good answer. Sometimes you think like, yeah, of course I want to, make millions of dollars and retire as early as possible and, do the whole fire movement of, be financially independent and retire early and travel the world and things like that. But again, it's important to plan. So I think it's important to, getting early, have your assets so that you get to a point where you work because you want to, not because you have to. In Australia, obviously, we're very lucky to have a super system, and then there's tax benefits there and things like that. But like one of the things I tell myself is, when I'm in that retirement age, if I have to rely on my super to get by, I'd be pretty disappointed in myself. I'd be like, is that the only source of income I have? So that's one way to look at it. So that's one goal I have. Like obviously by that time, I'd want to have my own asset class and passive income and things like that, where I'd be able to depend on that. And then if a super comes, be like, wow, what a pleasant surprise. I didn't know this money was waiting for me. So that would be one. The other thing which I mentioned is like maybe towards 50s, I would like to slowly slow down and focus more on just winding back and implement the plan of dying with zero and spending what I have rather than keep accumulating. And the third is like day to day. Like I still, and my wife as well, we struggle a lot. She's a doctor as well, and then for majority of her life we've been broke and worked really hard and didn't spend a lot. So now when we are lucky enough to have access to money and enjoy nice experiences, just doesn't feel right. Just because all our life we've been such cheapos. This is suddenly spending on a nicer flight or staying in a nicer hotel just doesn't feel like. But we are transitioning slowly and trying to have more holidays and better holidays. But again, it's learning. You have to unlearn some things and some behaviors you've had for most of your life.
I think it's also like that subcontinent ethnic mentality. Even if you
100%,
even
yeah.
if you have the money, you're like, but Jetstar's doing a sale, It's
I
like
know, I know, and it's
it's
interesting. I've recently been thinking about value. So what happens is like when you're young, right? Like whatever you do, it's because of the lower end of the price tag, you try to get most value of it. So as you said, the Jetstar flight will be $200. You're going to Bali. That's awesome. And then like once you are lucky enough in a place to afford nicer things, you look at a flight and it's like Qantas is $600, and then you're just like, is it really worth the $400? Do I get enough value? And then you pay for it, but then your expectation goes up, and then you're actually not as happy. So, apart from money, I think a lot about happiness and joy, and that can be another podcast. But I think, yeah, sorry, man.
that's definitely a podcast. One of
Absolutely.
those, how to be happy. Every moment,
100%.
But
So last plug on that one, and I think I read a lot of books, and one of the other books I'm reading now is called Second Mountain, and this book talks about how the first mountain is you think all your life about the career you want to do and get to the peak and reach the top and make all this money, and then you realize, oh, there's this whole second mountain which is about finding joy and happiness and money, and success just doesn't bring all that. So that's an interesting kind of way to look at it. But anyways, going back to your question, sorry, I don't have a good answer. It's maybe you ask me in 10 years time, I'll have something completely different, but those are some thoughts.
no, well, you're a wise man. I feel like the our viewers are probably going to be asking for more episodes if you want. But I actually think it's a good thing that you don't have an answer, right? Because it's like there should be one, it's good to plan, and I'll talk about what some of the possible outcomes are, but it's good that it's a shifting goal, right? Because one, that just shows that you're evolving as a person day to day, and you're like maturing throughout your lifetime, right? And obviously there is the what I call like protective element of property investing, or like just investing. Like, you got to beat inflation. You got to do something with your money, right? If your money is sitting as money, it's losing value over time. Money that you earned yesterday is not as valuable as money to, I mean, like one day, like whatever, right? But like across a 5 year span, it's never as valuable as it was in the past, right? So that's the protective element. In terms of the like longer term outcome element, again, like it is a shifting outcome. I think like two easy heuristics for those at home to think about is there's basically two things you can get out of your portfolio, right? One is passive income through the rent. Number two is the capital if you sell your properties, right? And I think a good place, a good headspace to start in your investing journey, and you can always change that over time, is what numbers do I want to achieve, right? It's like, do I want 300K passive income by the time I'm 40? Do I want 100K passive income by the time I'm 30? Do I want 700K by the time I'm 40? A lot of this will be dependent on things like how much money you make, how much money you save, how your investing style. And you can sit down with, your team to see if your expectations are reasonable. I sometimes have clients come and they're like, yo, my goal is 300K by this age. And I'm like, the only way that that's possible is if you triple your income, then like, we can make it happen. But those are like two of the easy ways to think about it, right? And then if you have a good team, they'll just help you modulate that to achieve your goals, but it will change over time, right? Like, I have a lot of younger investors that like, when they first start, they're like, when they first start, they want to get a high amount of passive income early, right? But then when they get into their career, they see the power of compounding, plus they see the fact that they enjoy their career. They're like, you know what, let me invest for a bit longer and I'll focus on the passive income later, right? Especially doctors, where it's like, I don't think there's many doctors who've studied for so long and then are like, oh, I want to retire in 5 years, right? So like most of them that I've met, they're passionate, right? And maybe they don't want to be working the extensive hours. And I think one of the points he said is work because you want to, not because you have to. If you can get to that point in life, I think you'll enjoy your work a lot more. It'll be a lot lower stress free, and you can focus on the projects you want to focus on, right? Like maybe there might be a specific project that's lower paying, but you'd be like, that's the thing that I feel like has the most impact, or the thing that I enjoy doing. You can do that, right? And again, that comes down to how can you achieve that idea of working because you want to, not because you have to, is by building that passive income stream, right? And if you have a clear property investment strategy, it's very doable, right? Like what those numbers achievable are, it's very dependent on circumstance, and I don't want to throw out random numbers over here just because it'll be dependent on individuals. But one thing I recommend, if you're interested, you can comment on this podcast wherever you're watching it. We actually have a tool which I'm sharing right now, and it's built specifically for doctors. You can basically it's got the averaged out salaries for every single specialty. You can pick then you can put in additional elements here as well. You can plan out your rough expenses. But the nice part over here is you can pick your what you call the specialty that you're practicing and your investment style, and it'll give you a rough idea of how much of what you can achieve, right? So it's like this individual by year 20, they're making 200K a year passive income, and they've got roughly $10 million worth of equity, right? They went for this cash flow style of investing, and what was there? And they pick general surgery, right? So you can pick anything you want over here and get a rough idea. Again, this is just like a projector, right? Use it as like an indicator to see what numbers are possible. It could be very, very a lot lower or a lot higher depending on multiple circumstances. But I think it's a nice tool to get a rough idea, right? So let's pick any specific one that you said your gastro, right? Let's pick gastro. I'm pretty sure you will outperform these numbers by a decent amount. One, because you don't have hex. Two, because you started a lot earlier. But let's go gastro, cash flow, style of investing. Again, around 210K passive income by year 20, right? With roughly a $16 million portfolio, 10 million equity, 16 million debt, right? So if you're keen, give this drop a comment. There's a video, oh, sorry, there's a video with some instructions on how to use this. It's a pretty simple, clean, easy tool to use. I know it looks quite complex, but it's actually pretty easy to use. But definitely a fun little tool if you're a doctor. I just thought I'd plug it in there for those who
I think,
find it.
yeah, I'll give it a shout out to you as well, Ashad, because I think one of the things that I've struggled with these kind of things is a lot of advice that you get early on is to go see a financial planner and watch videos and things like that. And I've always kind of struggled with it again, just being busy with work and training and things like that, just not having good numbers. Like, we don't budget. I just don't have that much time. So again, it's a learning process. So whenever I went to a financial planner where they want exact numbers of how much you make every fortnight and how much you make every month and what is your expense, and I've always been pretty put off and intimidated by that because a lot of, if there's doctors watching, they'd know like our pay slip just varies every fortnight depending on like if it's an overnight shift, it's a day shift, and if anyone can decide for that pay slip, good on them, because I've never been able to decide for mine. But and one of the things I've really enjoyed working with you is because you're pretty flexible with that. Like that's why you have these like prediction tools where and oftentimes previous conversations you've helped me figure those numbers out by giving a range of like this is the minimum, this is the maximum, this is in the middle. Let's run these three numbers and compare. And I've always really liked that approach rather than just being asked again and again how much exactly do you spend on fuel every month. I'm sure there's some people who can give you those numbers. It's just not something that we do. Probably it's a good thing, but we just don't have the time, and we use our brain space for other things. So yeah, prediction tools like that where you can just chuck in some numbers and know what you expect, even if it's a ballpark range, I found very helpful.
Exactly. And I think it comes back to that initial point that we were discussing as well. You will make so much more money from building wealth rather than saving money, right? Obviously, it's good to do both, right? But if you think about it, like you can't save your way to $1 billion, right? If you can do that, then like if you can, you're probably earning a crazy amount of money and already, right? It's even just saving yourself to like a net worth of 5 million is probably really difficult, right? So obviously it's good to have practices for saving, right? And especially depends on your income, but for doctors who are higher income, like you don't have to sacrifice that much lifestyle to achieve really good investment goals. But unfortunately for people who are lower income or middle income, right, there is an element of sacrifice that is a bit more than those people who are higher income. And I've seen some people, like I have some younger clients who are like super impressive. Like they're on like 80K per year and they've figured out ways, saved, and they're in mid-20s and they're into property number 3. That's like the amount that they have to be saving and the discipline, and all respect to them. There's no way I would be able to do that personally, right? Like 80K a year is like, I mean, it's a good salary, but it's like saving for investments on top of that is very impressive, right? So the lower you make, the more important saving becomes. But once you're making a lot of money, like a lot of doctors are going to, plus the banks just love you guys, right? It's like almost to the point where it's a little bit weird, but like it works for you guys, right? Like just use your money and your leverage and let that money make money for you, right? And then you'll get there, right? So in terms of goals, I think we've talked about quite a lot about it, or like why to invest in property. We talked about using equity. We talked about using your borrowing power. We talked about the tax advantages. Obviously, we've briefly touched on those. Those are probably like 3 to 4 hour discussions themselves, and you can reach out to us. And then we finally talked about building passive income. Let's next jump into talking about, I think we already we talked about goal setting. Let's next jump into I guess, the specifics of investing, right? So now let's say take someone like yourself, Theo. Let's say a friend of yours who's, a doctor, they're roughly in the same place, and maybe they've bought their home and they have some equity, and now they're like, I want to start investing, right? How do they not make mistakes? And what's the best way to approach property investing as a doctor?
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And again, this is just my perspective on how I think of things, and I'm sure there's other different perspectives and better perspectives. But from my point of view, I think one of the things to think about, especially as a young person, who often like someone like myself who wasn't very financially literate early on in my career, I think it's important to think about: are you buying a property for investment? Or are you buying a property for yourself? Because I think culturally, like I have uncles who've been in Australia, or like family members who got really lucky with buying their property. I'm sure you've come across an uncle, who said, "Oh, I moved to Sydney and bought a property for 60,000. Now it's like 16 million or something like that." So inevitably, what's happened is there's this idea that the property that you live in is an investment. Like, it's just a natural thing that I at least used to assume. So I think it's personally, I find that you have to really shift your mindset about investment properties compared to buying a property for yourself. Like I said, when my wife and I initially bought a property, like again, we worked really hard. We've been living in student accommodations for 6-7 years when we went to medical school and moved regionally or rurally. And when we wanted to get a place, we wanted to get something nice. So we looked at the northern suburbs where we were working, and the suburb we were looking at is a 10 to 15-year-old suburb. So a lot of the houses were a bit older. But we wanted to live somewhere nice. So inevitably, we got something that's recently renovated, a smaller land, looks nice. So it wasn't the best investment, but we were really, we were stoked living there, and we really enjoyed living there. So I think first thing is that just, moving that or being clear on like, are you buying to live there or as an investment? And I think there's like this whole rent vesting concept that we can talk about as well, and you can add your thoughts on it. So I think that's number one. If it's your own property, I think it's worth just going with your heart. Obviously, it's your money, but like it's a place that you would want to live in, and I really prioritize happiness. I think being happy is number one, and health, and then money and family. No, actually, family, money. So I think it's important to just focus on that, finding a place that you like, you want to live, etc. When it comes to investment, I think it's really important to detach yourself emotionally. And I learned this the hard way because we came to an auction to buy our own property. And I remember what my wife and I talked, and we said, 700, that's what we're going to pay. That's it. We paid like 850 or something like that. Like it was just because we just liked the property, and you get into the heat of it, and you have so much emotion in that attached. And I like at that moment, I knew I overpaid, but we just really wanted that place. That's why I find with investment property, I've just tried to keep emotions away, find professionals who can help me do this, and then just sign the papers and look at the final outcome, but just not have to do all the research and spend time. There's a lot of thought sometimes that if you bought your own property, you could do investment as well. But personally for me, I think it was important for me to detach my emotions. And second, I thought if I'm putting so much money and having such risks, I rather get some advice and let people do it who do it day to day and think about it all the time, rather than someone like myself who barely has time during the week to think about it. And rather than learning all of it, I can pick an extra shift and use that extra income to get some professionals. So for someone like myself, it's been initially going to a broker, finding a good broker who understands how payslips work for doctors and you have a good relationship with. And then obviously the borrowing power and capacity and etc. They help you with those sort of things. And the other part for me was the buyer's agent who kind of deal with all of that, from security of property and renting it out and tenanting and all that kind of stuff. So if I had to put a time collectively, sometimes some of the properties we've got, I don't think I put even more than 30 hours in the whole process. It was mostly just getting the emails, making sure everything's okay, signing things off. If anything, the most annoying thing has been how some of the banks want you to actually physically sign papers. So like the broker does everything. It gets mailed to us. I have to like actually sign it and then find some time to drop it to the post office has been the hardest thing. But if you get the right people and get some help, it's not that hard.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. Again, a lot of good points. I think one of the interesting points you touched on over there is the older generation, right? And how things have changed a lot, right? Because it's like if you just think about someone 40 years ago, right? The property that they're buying is in an inner city suburb. It's probably decent land size, right? Those two factors already make it a great investment. Like their first home is 700 square meters in Coburg, right? If I'm using Melbourne as an example, think of your relative similar suburb in whichever city you're in. That's a great investment across the long term, right? But
Yeah,
these
I think what's important is they would have not looked at it that way.
they wouldn't have thought about it, right? And that's why, like a lot of these uncles, they think they're genius investors. They're like, look how much money, but it's like you just got lucky that the way cities were structured was different. Whereas now, like a lot of people, they're like, oh, I'm just gonna buy my first home. I'm gonna go buy an apartment, so it's near to where I live, whatever, whatever. And then they end up sacrificing a lot of investment quality for their own home, which again is fine if that's what you want, right? But it is something I think is important to actively think about as you go through that process to understand it, right? And then when you eventually do decide, right, which assets are your investments, completely emotionally detach. And again, come back to, I think, the point that you mentioned, having a great team, right? So when it comes to investing, I'd say investing in property, there's three really important people, right? So the first is your broker. If you're a doctor, just don't go directly to the banks. Get a really good broker, and they will work wonders for you, right? There's so many ways to increase your bar, to just like manipulate different policies. I don't like the word manipulate, but let's go with that, right? Manipulate different policies.
Even smaller things, actually, like one of the things that I'm really grateful for from yourself and my broker is the access after hours. Every single meeting I've had with my broker is like past 8 p.m.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
bank person, I would never get them before 5, but I'm working almost 7 days a week or 6 days a week. And
And we'll shout out Rick and Gagan from Wiz Wealth if you're
yes, of course.
listening. It's like they're great brokers. If you don't have a broker, you can reach out to us and we'll connect you with them, or you can definitely reach out to them. I hope they don't mind me mentioning their names. I'm sure they'd be more than happy.
Yeah, we've worked with them
But
for ages, and like Rick
yeah,
is available all the time for us, and we've really appreciated
yeah, exactly right. And I think like the important thing with a broker, a lot of people just make an assumption that a good broker is someone who will get the loan documents done and get you the loan, right? That's the minimum, right? If they can't do that, then they're just a terrible broker, right? But a really good broker will give you insight on how to structure your debt, structure the assets in a way that you can increase your cash flow, decrease your costs, plus also keep building your portfolio and purchasing more properties, right? And people like Gagan and Rick and other really good brokers, this is something that they'll have, right? So firstly, a good broker that is not just a person who gets you the loan, but is an investment advisor on how to structure your lending, right? Number two is an accountant. Super important. Like you're going through a lot of this now, thinking about the structuring of your portfolio, buying under trust, so on and so forth. Like I'm not going to jump into that topic because like one, that's like another, it's a huge topic, right? But a good accountant will make that difference, right? Over the long term. No one, you hear these people who have like massive portfolios, you can't do all of that under your personal name, right? And even if you do, you're leaving so much money on the table in terms of from a tax perspective, uh from like a few different perspectives, right? So accountant's super important. And then the final one, which I'd say, like maybe there's a bit of bias because I'm one of them, is a buyer's agent, right? We've back in the day, the way people invested is, oh, there's a new mall opening up over there. Just like, my cousin said this, and oh, I lived in this area, so I'm going to invest here. But now there's this shift in the way people think about investing to this data-based form of investing, right? And especially, I think, since the beginning of COVID, when a lot more people became comfortable with uh, with interstate investing, right? And similar to yourself, right? Majority of your assets actually aren't even in Victoria, right? WA, Queensland, and you've seen massive growth on them because you purchased them at the right time of the cycle, right? And if you follow a database approach of investing, you can get that long-term growth. Generally, getting long-term growth in property isn't difficult, right? Like most areas, unless you're buying a terrible asset, if you buy a good house in a decent location, you're good over the long term, right? But you could have had 400K growth in the first couple of years and use that equity to buy the next one faster, right? And that's where this database style of investing becomes really important because you can scale your portfolio a lot faster, right? And the nice thing about property compared to other asset classes, most asset classes, right? Everyone who's buying them are investors, right? So data actually isn't super useful for short-term gains because if there's something unique there, everyone will go there and that'll average it out, right? Whereas with property, majority of the buyers are actually homeowners, right? And homeowners aren't thinking about it from an investment perspective. They're just thinking about it from a homeowner perspective, right? So it's what we call an inefficient market. And in an inefficient market, you can find unique areas that you can follow that and then get that really aggressive growth, right? And this is stuff that you've seen. I think like some of your properties within the first 12 to 18 months are up like a very decent amount, right? Like in the six figures, which is very impressive, right? And that's the one of the useful parts of having a buyer's agent. And even if you don't use a buyer's agent, go through this process. Don't invest based off of qualitative factors. Oh, it's near the coast. It's this, like, there's a new mall there. There's some like population growth there, whatever. All of the qualitative factors are represented in the quantitative data, right? So if the data is off, then it's a bad area to invest in. What data means in the property space, again, that's a whole separate podcast, which you can follow us and we'll be putting stuff out on that. We actually have a few data podcast webinars on each of the states on our YouTube page. So you can give that, giving the page a cheeky plug. You can check that out. But I definitely think if you build that core team, right, then all you need to do is just like make sure you got a good team, right? And then just make as much like focus on your career and making more money, right? The time that you could have spent on like, especially for high income earners like yourself, the time you would have spent on investing, like, figuring out how to invest, you could have just picked up another 3 to 4 shifts, paid a professional, focused on your career a bit more, and got a much better result, like you mentioned, right? So that's I guess, a very base look at the specifics. The more important part of it is build that team, reach out to ourselves, or just reach out to anyone within this industry and start to look through the process, right? So next, let's jump into, and I know this is taking quite a while, like we'll aim to wrap it up, but let's jump into something for the younger people out there, right? I know again, there's going to be a lot of younger doctors watching this. We have a lot of young doctors in our audience, right? That still like, interns, PGY1, PGY2, 3, around there, right? And I want to talk about entering the market, right? So you touched based on a few things, right? So firstly is entering the market from from the fact that doctors have better deals, right? Through the banks. Tell us a little bit about that and what your experience was and some useful information for those listening at home.
Yep, absolutely. So I think, yeah, we briefly mentioned before, there's a much smaller percentage that you need in terms of deposit if you're a healthcare professional. There's also this LMI waiver that you get, which I think really helps because you can, again, put a smaller deposit rather than having to put 20% to get that LMI waiver. So overall, you just need like, a relatively smaller amount to get started compared to anybody else. Yeah, it just doesn't get better than that.
Yeah, beautiful. I don't think it's super complicated, right? It's like you can enter the market a lot earlier if you're a doctor, right? Again, doctors are categorized as very low risk, so you can get smaller deposits, LMI waivers, and just get into the market as early as possible, right? Obviously, buy a good asset, but the earlier you start, any form of good investing compounds over time, right? Like compounding is exponential, right? It's not, so it's like the earlier you start, the more time you have, and the sooner you'll hit that, what do we call, point of inflection, right? That's what they call it, right? When it starts to like rapidly go up, right? And that's what you'll see, right? It's like in your first five, the amount of capital growth you'll get in the second 5 years of investing is going to be 3 to 4x what you'll get in the first 5 years of investing. So that's the first thing, and that's the most basic one. There are a couple of other two unique ways to approach it, right? So the first one, this would have in no way been possible for you, is using a guarantor as an international student, just not an option, right? You know, we don't have that privilege, but I'm a really big believer that if you have it as an option, speak to your parents. It's actually, I'd say two things. I don't want to, again, it's a whole different topic. We have a YouTube video discussing it in depth, but with guarantors, two things to flag is one, it's actually not high risk at all, right? A lot of people have this assumption that using a guarantor is really dangerous and they're going to come and take your parents' home away. And, you know, your parents are going to be, it's actually very low risk if you understand how to approach it properly. Number two is if you're going guarantor, you can enter the market with pretty much $0. They'll cover your stamp duty. They'll pretty much cover everything, all right? And you can enter the market with effectively $0, buy your first property. And then number three is you can use guarantors for investment for your first investment property. A lot of people have this assumption it's just for their own home, but it's not just for their own home, right? And then one more thing I'll touch base on is rent vesting, right? Again, huge topic. We'll have like a 1 hour video. I'm a huge believer in rent vesting, especially for doctors, because you don't know where you're going to be early on, right? Like there's that period in your career. I mean, some people are lucky, but for a lot of them, there's a period in their career where they don't know where they're going to be for the next 5, 7 years, right? So it's like, what's the point of buying a home that's a 6 out of 10 as an investment, or maybe a 3 out of 10? You know, maybe you're lucky and the area you want to live is actually a 9 out of 10, but what are the odds, right? Let's assume that that's not the case. For everyone else, you're buying a home in an area and you're not even going to live in that home for the next 4 to 5 years, right? Plus, there's the fact that with doctors, your salary is going to drastically increase, and your first home is most likely not your forever home, right? Like pretty much all doctors upsize at some point, right? So it's like having that opportunity to just start off, rent a good home that you like, right? And then just buy investment properties comes with, I think, a lot of benefits, but whole different topic. Watch the video that we have on it. It'll give you some really good insight on how to think about rent vesting and the pros. And there are a few cons of rent vesting, but I'm a big fan of that as well. Any other useful advice for the young doctors watching out here? I know one point you mentioned is you locumed quite a lot. What are some of the benefits of that in relation to investing, and the cons of it? Like, I don't know, I could be wrong, but I've heard quite a lot that it could possibly negatively impact your career prospects. Let's talk about locuming a bit, some of the pros and cons of that, just very quickly before we tie up.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's just important to time and have a plan on what you want to do and how you want to do it. So the way medicine works, unfortunately, is a bit of a treadmill-like system where you finish medical school and that's just the beginning. You do your internship, you do your residency, and then there's some sort of training program that you have to get on. Almost majority of doctors end up getting a fellowship. There is a small percentage of people who just do locum lifelong, and they're called career medical officers, and it's a minority, but that's an option, but not something that I can talk much about, as I don't know. I'm generally a very anxious person, so I always wanted to make sure I follow the usual path, and a part of that is getting some sort of fellowship either in a surgical specialty or a physician specialty, or become a general practitioner. And these are getting more and more competitive, these spots. So there's lots of things you have to do in terms of getting in and timing it. There's a term we use called unaccredited. So you have to kind of do these unaccredited years where you're just working as essentially the same job that you would do if you were in training, but you're not in training. You're not working towards the fellowship.
Limbo. Yeah,
Yeah,
that
no, and it's really tough, especially for our surgical colleagues, where some people, are doing unaccredited years for 4 or 5 years, and all they've done is orthopedics, for example, and then if they're not able to get into training program after that, what do you do? It's just yeah, just not something I'm a big fan of. So I think it's important to plan that. So like I've heard of people who for example finish the internship and for the general year, they just take a year off. Like it's a nice time. You've got access to some money. You can locum at that time. And at the same time, they do some research projects, build up their CV while picking up additional shifts. So, that's one. Some people just travel and work for 6 months as a locum and then travel and then tick box all the bucket listings that you wanted to do all your life but you couldn't because you were probably studying for 30 years. That's another advantage in terms of I don't know if it like specifically affects your career like just having a locum year or a gap year, but it's more than that. Like it's just the competition, like maybe in that particular year there were more spots for a training program that you wanted to get into, and the next year they've either made the requirements harder, it's gotten more competitive, there's less spots, yada yada. So all that kind of stuff. You just have to like do your research, think about it, plan. The other thing I think, again, as I said, like I have a lot of anxiety around these things. Is a financial anxiety aspect of it. If you obviously have a full-time job, which I've always had since I finished medical school, it's got its cushion where you have sick leave, annual leave, you get paid for everything, you have fixed income. So with locum things, what happens is, which is a funny trend that I've noticed in the last few years, where at the start of the year, there's not much locum shift because everyone's really enthusiastic and motivated and do their full-time job. But by the year passes and mid-year, a lot of people quit their jobs and are burnt out. And only then a lot of locum shift becomes available. So it depends on, where you want to locum, where you want to go. So yeah, those are some of the pros and cons of locuming.
beautiful, beautiful. Again, great insights. So I think we'll tie it off over there. Quite a long podcast, hopefully, or interview for all those listening at home. We hope you really enjoyed it. This is just the beginning of some of the content that we're going to be putting out. We'll touch base on that shortly. But Shahid, I really wanted to thank you for your time as well and the great insights that you've given everyone. For all those listening at home, feel free to reach out directly to us as part of promotion, as part of this podcast is for any doctors. We're doing a 45-minute free strategy session. No sales pitch in that 45-minute strategy session at all. We'll just come educate you on all things property and how to look at it. And then you can do with that whatever you want to do. But let's talk about one of the big announcements we have off of the back of this podcast. And that is the community that we're going to be creating to help doctors. Shahid, do you want to, I guess, give a short announcement and I'll tell the people a little bit more about that. And hopefully it'll be a really useful resource for all the doctors, dentists that will be in that space.
Yeah, absolutely. Basically, Arshad is very generous with his time, and I often have questions for Arshad, and I often reach out, and we have these long voice notes or text messages back and forth, just talking about different things, property, specifically from a doctor perspective, given my circumstance. And look, we don't have all the answers, but we definitely think a lot about it and talk a lot about it. So we thought, one of the ways of just structuring it would be perhaps starting a Facebook group, which would be like, mostly on property investing for doctors or property for doctors, and just Arshad with his insights and some of my experiences of having gotten 5 properties now. We can share some content, build a community, answer some questions, and yeah, just have a safe space where we can talk everything property, especially keeping in mind about the circumstances that doctors are usually into in terms of their career and finances.
Yeah, beautiful, right? So the link will be down below, whatever platform you're engaging with this on. It'll be there in the either in the comments or the description. Definitely join the group. In the group, we'll have sophisticated investors like Shahid that are doctors, sophisticated doctor investors or dentists, other healthcare profession investors, giving their insight into how they invested. We'll also have professionals that primarily work with doctors in this space, giving their insight. And then finally, we'll just have people like yourself that can share their thoughts, share their insights, and more importantly, just ask like any question not just property investment, but anything remotely related to property. Wills and estates, there'll be a lawyer that works with doctors specifically. If it's something related to the property management of the house that you own, there's something wrong with it, there will be a property management specialist in there who can give you pretty much any insight to anything remotely related to property, whether it's your own home, whether it's investment, whether whatever it is, right? So, and again, it'll all be some of the stuff is true whether you're a doctor or not, right? Like, but a lot of it, especially from a strategic perspective, is very different if you're a doctor, and the resources we'll be sharing in there will be very unique from that perspective, and we'll have a lot of great insight from sophisticated investors who'll be managing the group that are doctors like Shahed and a couple of others who we'll be engaging with as well. So I think we'll tie it off there. Shahed, any final thoughts for all the doctor investors at home who are either at the beginning of their journey or they're thinking about property investing? Any final message for them?
Yeah, I think we've spoken about lots of things, and a big part of that is just planning, knowing what you want. It's okay to have a shifting goal, as you said. It's just important to start early, and yeah, just I think leaving with some philosophical thoughts of there's limited time in whatever we do, so that time is precious. You want to do things early in life rather than later. If you want to travel or have trips, you want to do when you're healthy rather than having to wait too long. And I think sometimes we're just disadvantaged as doctors, where you spend a big chunk of your career just training and studying, and then you miss out on all those experiences. And I found property has been a way for us to just kind of get a bit early on that financial race, where we don't have to wait till we retire to do things. We can have access to passive income or other sources of income early on, to tick off the things that we really want to do.
Beautiful. Thanks so much, Shahid. Thank you for everyone listening at home, and looking forward to seeing you all in future episodes. Bye.